Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing our series of lectures on the antebellum period, that time period right before the Civil War. Today we're going to start to discuss some of the political conflicts that are happening in the United States. And so, what you have to understand when we're talking about the political conflicts in the antebellum period is that it's almost always concerning the expansion of the United States. And are these territories that we had just gained from the Mexican American War, from the diplomatic process with Great Britain and Oregon, from purchase, are all of those territories when they come into the Union, are they going to come in as free or slave states? And so at this point in history, we have 22 states, 11 free and 11 slave. So that means there is a balance of power in the United States Senate. And so neither the anti slavery faction or the pro slavery faction can pass laws that benefit their side. And so there kind of has to be compromise. And so, every time a new territory starts to, say, hey, we want to be a state, the whole thing kind of erupts politically because is that territory going to be free or slave? And so we'll see a series of compromises that are going to be enacted, and Henry Clay is going to be a big part of this. Henry Clay, the great compromiser. That are going to try and maintain that balance. Eventually, that balance will break, and it's just going to have to break. There's more territory in America that is not conducive to slavery than territory that is. And so eventually the free states are going to get an advantage, a political advantage in the United States Senate. And, the South kind of sees the writing on the wall. As far as that is concerned. So they try to hold on as long as possible. They try to, increase the slave states' power as much as possible. But as this balance begins to unsettle, the slave states really start to think that the only way that their way of life can be maintained is if they leave the Union. And so this great debate happens. Who should be able to determine the future of slavery? Should it be Congress, which is what the abolitionists believe, that anti-slavery people believe that Congress should be able to dictate that, which, because they know eventually they're going to be able to pass laws to end slavery? Or should it be the people? Should each state get to decide? And so a huge debate pops up. One of the first places where it's going to be apparent is going to be in Missouri. Missouri is going to apply to be a slave state, and so the slavery has been there for a while, and the people of Missouri want to maintain their status as a territory that is allowed to have slavery. Well, Northerners don't like that, right? And so there's going to be this, resistance among the people in the North to accept this. So what will end up having to happen, we want to expand. We want these states to be made states so, we can solidify our control over that territory and fully develop that land. And so a compromise breaks out. What will happen is Henry Clay, the great compromiser, he's going to, because he's such a good politician and is so great in Congress, that he's able to, essentially, stitch together compromises that are going to hold the Union together for, decades more. And so Henry Clay comes up with this compromise. And what he realizes is the area that we know today as Maine is actually, because of, charters from the British government from forever ago, the area known as Maine today actually belongs to Massachusetts. And so, but it's not very populated. It's whatever. And so, but it's this kind of like free land. And clearly it's up north. Slavery is not going to be profitable there. And so what Henry Clay essentially says is, look, we can make that territory that, people are using, but it's not, clamoring for statehood or anything. Let's use that territory, bring that territory in as a state, which will be a free state, and then bring Missouri in as a slave state, and then we still have a balance in the Senate. And so everybody kind of thinks, okay, that's a good solution. So Missouri becomes a slave state, Maine becomes a free state, and then Henry Clay doesn't want to continue to have these arguments. And what he says is, and what gets passed in the law is, let's draw a line across America, line of latitude, kind of a demarcation of the country. And so at 3630, which is that like bottom portion of Missouri state line, not that little boot heel at the end, but the bottom line of Missouri. And let's draw that across the country. And we'll say no slavery is allowed above that line. That the odds of slavery popping up above that line are very slim. Missouri's the exception, obviously, but and you could justify that it is below 3630 because of the little boot heel thing there. But we draw that line and say everything above that line has to be free, and everything below that line has the ability to become a slave state. And that's kind of the natural boundary, or close to the natural boundary, for where slavery is profitable and where slavery isn't profitable. And so this becomes the law of the land, and it's actually for the next like 30 years is going to be able to settle a lot of these questions without it being too much of a flare up. Now, it's still controversial, don't get me wrong, but eventually, with the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court, which is probably one of the worst Supreme Court cases, I hate to history's a process, and we do good things, we do bad things, and there's just, and I hate to put moral judgments on that, particularly, because we're viewing it from our 21st century, moral views, but Dred Scott is just an awful case. And Dred Scott is actually going to declare that the 3630 line demarcation is unconstitutional. And he's going to say, you just can't take away people's rights to choose, where slavery can go. And, which is going to, really upset people in the North, because it's going to open the doors to slavery expanding kind of unchecked. So Missouri Compromise holds for a long time until, 30 years down the road with Dred Scott, where, the 3630 is declared unconstitutional. So the next big, the next big political, blow up is going to come over the state of California. And this is, like I said, about 30 years later. California, wildly important state, is going to very quickly reach the number of people necessary to reach statehood. And so when they apply to become a state, we're going to need another compromise to be able to, appease both the North and the South. And so we'll need the Compromise of 1850. California, they got to the population necessary to become a state very quickly because of the California Gold Rush, where 100,000 people flocked to California to be able to try and get rich quick off of the gold rush. And so there had been a history of slavery in California, but because the Spanish controlled California and then the Mexicans controlled California. When the Spanish controlled California, their form of slavery, if you can believe it, is even more brutal than the American version of slavery. And it left a real distaste in the Mexicans' mouths and in the people of California's mouths. They just didn't like it. And so, Mexico, when they get their freedom from the Spanish, they outlaw slavery. And then, the people of California just aren't inclined to want to be free. So California applies for statehood, and then bam, we've got another controversy now. How are we going to? This is going to upset the balance. And so, if California tries to enter as free, which is what's going to happen, we're going to need, we're going to need something to appease the South for the South to accept this. And so again, Henry Clay is going to have to step in and try to, come up with an option that both sides are going to find acceptable. And so he's going to actually do this in a really ingenious way. He's not going to do it all at once. He's going to do it kind of piecemeal. So he's going to pass the Compromise of 1850 is actually a series of different laws that are going to be kind of passed in an order that is going to make sure that everybody stays happy. And so we're really talking about five major things, components to this law. The first is to this compromise. California gets admitted as a free state, which means that appeases the North. The second part is we're going to start to organize both New Mexico and Utah as territories and not reference slavery at all. Now, the understanding here is this is pretty neutral, that both sides will agree to this because the likelihood is that New Mexico will enter as a slave state, whereas Utah, which is populated heavily by Mormons, would enter as a free state. And so that's kind of a wash. Both sides are happy there. Number three, Texas has very rapidly become one of the most important slave states, territories in America. It's huge. It's got a gigantic, impact in the economy, the Southern economy. Growing population, but it's fragile. It's fragile because it had to fight for its own independence, and when it was fighting Mexico for its own independence, it racked up all kinds of debt, and so the survival of Texas is in question because of that debt. And so, the South recognizes that if they're going to be a power, that Texas needs to be secured. And so, one way to do that is to have the national government, the federal government, assume the debt of Texas. And so, if California comes in free, right, and then New Mexico and Utah are organized without reference to slavery, right now, the North is kind of getting more out of this than what the South is. And so, assuming the debt of Texas becomes important to the South and is one of the things that is going to ease the kind of struggle of California entering the Union. They're going to outlaw the slave trade in Washington, D.C. You think that this is a victory for the North, no doubt about it. But even Southerners, a significant portion of Southerners recognize that it's just a bad look to have slaves being traded in our nation's capital. Democracy, land of the free and home of the brave, all men are created equal. And then, right there in our center of power of government, there's, slaves being traded on the steps of the Capitol building. It's a bad look. And so, both sides recognize that that's a bad look. So Southerners, a lot of Southerners would never say it publicly, but a lot of them, kind of privately are like, yeah, that's kind of a bad look. This is definitely a win for the North. There are many Southerners that are going to be upset by this because it is it looks like a victory for the North. But there's also a lot of Southerners that recognize that this is probably a good deal. And then this is the big one, more stringent fugitive slave laws. And so one of the biggest complaints of the South is that runaway slaves are property in their minds, legal property in their minds. They run away to the North, and then the North helps hide that property from the rightful owners down in the South. Now, today, we look at it through our 21st century moral compass, and we say, well, yeah, then slavery is evil and no way we should hand those people back. But from the Southern perspective, what they're saying is, the Underground Railroad is being funded by Northerners. They're sending down, Northern conductors to steal our property and then hide them in the North. And, really it's these Northern invaders that are, attacking us. And so they say we got to end that. And to do that, we need a fugitive slave law, which means a couple things. One, slave catchers from the South can head north to take the slave owner's property back, the slaves back. But it also is going to require that Northerners help bring the slaves back to the South if they know about it. And so Northern police departments, the federal government, everybody has to be on the same page that if there's a runaway slave, that slave can be brought back down to the South. This is a major victory for the southern states because they feel like, oh, great, we can go get our property back, and it's a victory for the slave owners because the Underground Railroad now heading from the south to the north just got extended by hundreds, if not thousands of miles, right? You're no longer safe in the north if you're a runaway slave. You're going to have to go all the way to Canada, which is a much harder journey, which is going to discourage slaves from running away. And it's going to have the northern police offices mandated to try and catch runaway slaves and bring them back down to the south, which means, you're in what used to be territory that was not hostile with the northern states now have become hostile to you. And so enemy territory just got extended by hundreds, if not, 1,000 or more miles. And so, this is devastating. And it means that you can't just hang out in the north anymore and start a life in the northern states. If you're free and maybe, you ran away 30 years ago and you've got a family in, let's say, Pennsylvania, which is a state that's just absolutely abolitionist. They hate slavery. You're totally safe there. Fugitive slave law passes, and then maybe you're not safe anymore. Maybe even though for 30 years, you have been living in the North and felt safe, now you're not safe anymore. And so you're going to see a mass exodus of African Americans into Canada. When that happens, that population of African Americans, the vast majority of them after the Civil War will return to America, and for a number of reasons. There's just much more economic opportunity for African Americans, for people of African descent in America than there is in Canada, and so they're just more suited for agriculture in warmer climates because that's what they had done previously. They have that skill set. And so most of them are going to come back. The North is going to be super upset at the fugitive slave laws. They're going to feel like it's the South forcing their will on the North. Both sides feel that way, by the way. The South feels that the North is sending down, conductors to steal their property. And then the North feels like with the fugitive slave law that they're forcing the North to do something that they find immoral. And so both sides, we're just starting to get to that irreconcilable differences where both sides start to think like maybe we're going to have to split, or the South is going to feel like, that they're going to have to split. And so compromise of 1850, although it will settle the problem for California, and California will get admitted. But it really is just the fugitive slave law is really just driving a deeper wedge between the North and the South. And places like Pennsylvania are just not going to enforce it. Many territories in the North just will not enforce the fugitive slave law. And the South is going to look at that. This is important because when the South leaves, they're going to say, we tried to compromise. We passed the fugitive slave law. This was a legally passed thing in a democracy, and the North refused to enforce it because most areas in the North are just going to refuse to enforce the fugitive slave law. And the South's going to say, we tried to get along, but you didn't follow through on your promises. And so, we're going to have to go do our own thing. So the effects of the compromise: the South temporarily will stop talking about secession because of the fugitive slave law. The North, because they will just refuse to accept the fugitive slave law. They're like, we're not going to do this thing that we think is immoral. And then overall, we're just postponing secession because when the North refuses to enact a fugitive slave law, the South begins to think that maybe if the North can't be trusted to follow through with their compromises, we should probably just become our own country, and then we don't have to worry about it. The next big area that is going to have a political blow up over the expansion of slavery is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska territory. So we've got this huge territory that this guy right here, Stephen Douglas, is very much going to want to have settled and make a state. Stephen Douglas is the senator from Illinois, and who we'll talk about later. He's going to, Abraham Lincoln is going to challenge him for his Senate seat. But he wants a railroad that is going to travel out west that will go through Illinois, right? So it's going to help the Illinois economy huge. That's going to travel through the Kansas area. Well, to do that, he really needs Kansas to become a state. And so he's got to try and figure out a way to make Kansas a state. And so he wants this railroad, right? But the South's not on board with it because this is above the 3630. Right. And so Stephen Douglas wants to organize this territory, but it's just the South is going to oppose it because it's above 3630 and means that it's going to have to come in as a slaves, or I'm sorry, as a free state. And so everybody kind of just realizes that the Kansas Nebraska territory, you cut it into two, that Nebraska is almost certainly going to come in free, right? The people there just are most likely going to reject slavery. Kansas, on the other hand, because it borders Missouri, and Missouri is a slave state, there's a good chance that Kansas might come in as a slave state if 3630 can be repealed. And so the Kansas Nebraska Act is going to essentially repeal the Missouri Compromise and that idea of 3630. And Stephen Douglas is going to justify that by saying, well, we're a democracy, and 3630 takes away your ability to vote for whether or not you want slavery. And so he champions an idea called popular sovereignty. He says, let's just let the people of Kansas vote, right? And if we're a democracy, they'll become free if they want to be free. They'll become slave if they want to be slave. Now, this is a northern senator, right? I mean, he's from a state that has, does not have slavery, and he's saying, let the people decide. And he's saying, let the people decide because it's what's best for Illinois to make Kansas a state so this railroad can get developed. And so he's not, as focused on or motivated by the slavery issue as that's not as important to him. It's more about him being able to develop this railroad. And so popular sovereignty will be how Kansas gets organized, which will result in what is known as bloody Kansas or bleeding Kansas. Because now that it's up to a vote, guess what's going to happen? Right? All kinds of anti-slavery Northerners are going to flood into Kansas, right? And so this is how strong in some areas of the country the abolitionist movement is. There are people that are deeply passionate. These are, white Northerners that hate slavery so much, they're going to pick up and move to Kansas to be a part of this vote to try and make sure that Kansas doesn't come in as a slave state. Well, the slave states, guess what they're going to do? Something very similar. Now, they don't have to, because Missouri is a slave state and it's adjacent to Kansas. They border each other. They're not going to have as many people just move into Missouri, like pick up their families and move into Kansas. They're just going to like travel over for the day. And so you're going to have border ruffians, that are people living in Missouri that are just going to flood into Kansas temporarily, and they're literally going to fight each other. There are going to be free towns that are filled with people that oppose slavery, and these border ruffians will come in and attack them. And then there are going to be guys like John Brown, who moves his family down to Kansas and massacres slave owners. I mean, literally chops them up with machetes, to discourage people from, promoting slavery in Kansas. And so it is a hot mess, bloody thing. And so this is going to essentially be the thing that breaks up the Democratic Party, right? The Republican Party, the former Whigs that are morphing into the Republicans during this time period, pretty solidly anti-slavery. It's a northern party, not very many southern Republicans. It's anathema down there. It's people just not going to accept it. The Democratic Party is now being split into two over Kansas. There are going to be northern Democrats that oppose slavery, and then there are going to be southern Democrats that are just absolutely pro-slavery. So northern anti-slavery Democrats and pro-slavery southern Democrats. And once their party splits up, that's going to create a pathway for a Republican to get elected, Abraham Lincoln, right? That will go on to ultimately end slavery, even though that's not his end game. So Kansas Nebraska Act, bloody Kansas, absolute hot mess. Kansas will actually end up with two competing governments. The election will go in favor of making Kansas a slave state. So, it looks like the let me move this here so you can see all that. It looks like the pro-slavery people have won here, but it's a rigged election. That's because people from Missouri voted in it. The people that are anti-slavery, they say, nope, this was an illegal election. The results shouldn't matter, and they're going to set up their own competing government and make themselves a free state. So we've got two states in Kansas. When the Civil War backs out, when the Civil War actually comes to fruition, which will be here relatively shortly, what'll happen is the Union will just start flooding in resources to kind of help out the anti-slavery people. South kind of does the same, and it all plays out during the Civil War. So this is, I think, a pretty decent indication of what is about to happen. The political process, if you've noticed, is falling apart. This is a key. This is something you should remember. So far, we've been able to solve our differences politically through discourse, through democracy, right? We've had all these compromises. But now with the Kansas Nebraska Act, we're starting to see that the compromise and the politics are gonna start to fail, right? Politics failed in Kansas. It failed because we resorted to violence to solve these issues, and we're going to see that's going to continue to be the case. All right, that's where we're going to leave off for today. We'll pick up with part 2 of the events that lead to secession tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly.